I'm going to be talking about all the decades of research that we've done here at the center and how that's a few examples of how that's informing the past and the present and the future of humpback whales. There really isn't time to get into a great deal of detail about all of this, but I'll give you some sort of pressing and prescient examples. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm a senior scientist. I've been at the center for 28 years, at which point back then I inherited this wonderful program that has continued on for more than 40 years over time. So just a quick thing about the center. I think that many of you already know that we're a highly diverse group of people doing a lot of different kinds of research. And again, the work that we do, by and large, in fact, all of it, I would say, is very responsive to what's going on in the world today. Ranges from fisheries to, marine debris, all kinds of things. But what we're known for primarily on the largest scale over time is our whale work, and that's whale research, both the Humpback Whale Studies Program and the right whale research that we've been doing for decades. And additionally, the disentanglement program, which is a leader in the world for disentangling whales from entangling gear. So I have some of the whale things highlighted there in red. But I am going to be focusing on our humpback whale work. So as I do that, what I'd like to do first, many of you are old hands at humpback whales, but perhaps not everybody is. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the species overall in general. And note in particular the fact that humpback whales, out of all of the whales species, they are really a gateway, I think, in many ways. So they are a unique species in terms of our ability to collect data from them, both because of their coastal distribution and some other things I'll talk about later. But in addition, the average person, many of the time, the humpback whale is going to be the most engaging, the first species perhaps they're able to see in person from a whale watch boat or something along those lines. And again, just their very nature, their activity, their breaching, as we see on the upper right-hand screen, their curiosity, as we see in the lower right of this window. That's a whale that's playing with kelp. Basically, this is a species that's very engaging, and it is an entry point for a lot of people in terms of being interested in whales and being interested and caring about the marine environment, both things that affect whales and more. So it's an important species. I'd just like to show you a silly looking image here. What I want to get across from this is that humpback whales in general, so this is a species that's found in all the world's oceans, in most places in the world, in most oceans, they're migrating between their grounds and their breeding grounds. And they're doing this seasonally, basically feeding at high latitudes and breeding at low latitude. So these are just a few examples as you look around the ocean, the world's oceans. You can see that they're making these migrations, these long migrations, and they're doing it every year. And as you're looking at this, you can see where we are, where I am. You guys are everywhere. But in the upper right, that's Cape Cod, highlighted in red with a red dot. And really, there's only one population, which is on the far left in the Indian Ocean, the Oman population, that really isn't making seasonal migrations. It's breeding and it's feeding, we believe, in roughly the same place. But making these big movements, and they're doing it sort of on alternate schedules. So as the whales in the northern hemisphere are heading south from their feeding grounds to their breeding grounds, the southern hemisphere is sort of doing the opposite. So that's why we don't necessarily have, in general, we don't have much overlap between populations, because they're spatially and they're separated. Humpback whales the whales in general, I would say, are record setters in terms of the amount of, excuse me, the distance that they're traveling for migration. A while back, this is from our research actually in another location, which I'll talk to you about later, but in the Southern Hemisphere, this was a distance record for mammals a few years ago. And I think now gray whales have exceeded it. But basically these movements that humpback whales are making, in this case, between their breeding ground in American Samoa and their feeding ground off the Antarctica, these are just tremendous distances. That's a over 9,000 kilometer one-way travel. And so multiply that by 2, and you have the kinds of movements that these individuals are making over time, all in 1 year. So it's pretty incredible what they're doing just on a constant basis. And so feeding, on the feeding grounds, these are just a few examples from here of the kinds of things that humpback whales eat, but they and zooplankton, most places that they are. And this feeding that they're doing is occurring from the spring through the fall, basically. And here in New England, we see basically they have a really long season where they're feeding here. It's essentially from March through December. And I'll just show you in the top figure there, where you have the humpback whale's mouth open, and all that glistening thing you see in there, those are little fish, those are sand lance, and it's just full of fish. And I've clicked now to show you, those are fish jumping out of the water. Humpback whales scare the fish out of the water and are basically capturing them, mainly underwater, but you can see the kind of densities of fish that humpback whales are corralling in order to feed. So as we get to the end of the feeding season, which we are past now, so these whales are making migrations down to the south. They don't do it like what I'm showing here. This is actually a picture from the breeding ground, but they're migrating often, we think, alone or maybe in small groups, but they're migrating south to breeding grounds into the warmer waters. And when they get there, it's really important. It's where all the calving takes place. So pregnant females are heading down to their breeding ground to give birth. And they spend a lot of time down there allowing their young to basically gain size and nutrients through nursing before they head back up north. But the other amazing thing that's going on down there is competitive groups and singing. So you can see down on the lower left, these are males. This is actually in Hawaii. But these are males that are fighting amongst each other for access to a female. So they are physically interacting. We don't think it's serious at all times, but they're doing that. But in addition, on the right, you'll see we have whales that are also singing, and males move back and forth between these roles. I'm not playing you a song, I'm just indicating it with the little notes there. But basically on their breeding grounds, this is where all of the mating is taking place for the most part, and calving. So those are critical times for them. And then once breeding season is over, which whales, individuals, we believe, are sort of stagger out from the breeding grounds back to their feeding grounds. And when they do this, they're bringing back with them a mature female who's had a calf. She's bringing her calf back with her, traveling back to the place where she fed and where she learned to feed from her own mother. And so both male and female calves are making this migration and heading back north. And this fidelity that they then essentially they imprint on this area. And so it's a fairly critical element of humpback whale population structure, and really part of the reason why we're able to study the species in the way that we do, because these females bring their calves, and then the calf from then that point onward, it returns year after year to the same feeding ground out of all of the possible feeding grounds in the North Atlantic Ocean. And so we are able to document individuals. We are able to follow the lives of those individuals, and we're able to see changes that occur. So on the right pane here, you can see this is an individual named Cobalt in the year of the calf. And then over time, we're able to see injuries that occur over Cobalt's lifetime and keep track of that. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, is that I'll talk more about the impacts on whales, but I guess leading up to what I was saying earlier, the movements that humpback whales and other whales make and their behaviors as they're doing that, we can't have very small focus, essentially, spatially, collaborative wise. You know, they're traveling across these large areas. And so our thinking about how to look at them and how to study them really has to be large. It has to be international in most cases. And this is meant to just share that just as their behavior and their lifestyle, their lifetime is spent over these massive areas, so are the threats. And so entanglement in fishing gear is one of the major known threats to humpback whales and other whale species. And this is just to show you that it's not unique to any one place. And it is quite possible that whales, as they travel from one place to the next, they're encountering these threats in these different parts of their range. And in general, in order to understand these individuals and their threats and the populations, we do need to work in different places. Again, we need to collaborate in order to get that job done. So I'm just going to focus now on the North Atlantic Ocean. And what you're seeing here is the main areas where humpback whales are known to feed and to breed, with one little exception that I'll explain. So these red dots, this is all from the Years of the North Atlantic Humpback Whale Project, which was an international collaboration. We were one of the primary instigators of this and a part of the work, both in the Gulf of Maine here and on the breeding grounds. And so these were areas where sampling was planned very specifically to try to give a sense of the number of humpback whales in the entire North Atlantic through statistics. So these areas show where that work focused. And this was back in 1992 and 1993. It was a huge effort. But now I just want to show you here, the area in red, that's the Gulf of Maine, here off of New England, and also up into the Bay of Fundy, Canada. So what you can see is what you couldn't see before, that it's an aggregation site, but it is not the only place where humpback whales are found along this coast. And this information that you're seeing now, this is actually something that has changed a little bit over time. So it used to be the case that there were very few humpback whales seen along the southern, middle and southern US coast. And now we're seeing it more. And it's a phenomenon that really began in the 1990s, was primarily a winter thing, and has expanded now to the waters off of New York, where we are seeing those individuals in summer. And this is, so it's a change in the way the population is using waters in the United States. Similar phenomena go on other areas. But basically, this will come into play a bit later in what I talk about. So Gulf of Maine, sorry about that. So you can see these are the southern areas, but what this means for us is that the Gulf of Maine is a huge area of focus for us in the North Atlantic Ocean. But it's a case where we do have to collaborate, and we have collaborated now for decades with folks who are on the water all the way down to Florida, to better understand what's been going on in terms of shifts in distribution and usage of water in these other parts of the US. And again, this is showing you these aggregation sites where the Gulf of Maine is the primary one in US waters, with some now use around that to the south. On the left, what you'll see is, so it's a feeding ground, and then you have this migration route down to the breeding ground. It's in dashes because we've known about this connection between the Gulf of Maine and the western portion of the breeding ground in the West Indies area. We've known about that from seeing individuals in one place or another. But in general, we hadn't known exactly how that migration took place. There was a lot of thought that perhaps it was mainly coastal, but then data suggested that was not the case. So humpback whales here are not doing a coastal migration, they're doing an ocean migration. And if you look at the right pane, this is from satellite tagging work that we did in 2018. This is the first time that we had a glimpse of exactly how a humpback whale gets from its feeding ground in the Gulf of Maine to its breeding ground in the Caribbean. So it's the only one. We don't have data on any other ones from these 2 points in time. So, and then here we are on Silver Bank. These are shallow areas, coral heads and things of that nature. Some of you are knowing that quite well from your visiting those areas. But the Center for Coastal Studies conducted a number of years of research, some of the earliest research on the individual humpback whales that spend time in the Caribbean, in this case, Silver Bank, but also other portions of the Caribbean, which has provided some of the sort of foundational information about the population. I've been peppering in our research, but I did just want to explain a little bit about how we do the work that we do. I mentioned it has to be on a big scale, but what do we collect? So I'm going to talk about some of the most important data that we're collecting. First of all, as I mentioned, we need to have a big scale. So we've been working in the Caribbean and the West Indies. We've have long-term important research, sort of keystone research for us in the Gulf of Maine feeding ground. But in addition to understand humpback whales in the North Atlantic, we've done work in Greenland as well. And then we have extended to other parts of the North Atlantic, so of the world. So American Samoa is in the Southern Hemisphere, and that's actually the only breeding ground in the Southern Hemisphere that's actually in US waters. American Samoa is a territory of the US. And then in Hawaii, that's a breeding ground in US waters in the North Pacific. In terms of the samples that we collect, some of the original, the first data that we were collecting was from photo ID, and that's because individual humpback whales can be identified from their natural markings. So this is the case of photographing the flukes, the underside of the flukes, which we can use to track individuals over time. And as we do that, we're collecting from one time to the next, sort of a record of individuals and their lives. Another important element of that is we're allowed to add on to that, or we're able to add on to that samples that we collect at these intervals. So these may be all kinds of different things, but what's been really important have been samples, a little bit of skin, a little bit of blubber that we've collected from individual humpback whales over time that we can then use different kinds of analytical tools to analyze. But in addition to that, it's just a range of all these different kinds of behavior, of information, the whale's behavior, its health at any particular time, and then what it's eating. All of these things we link together to the individual, which is something that we're able to do. And it actually is not that common to be able to have this kind of really detailed record of individual humpback whales. So this is just showing you again the underside of the tail of humpback whales that we've cataloged. A few of them, we've actually cataloged over 3,000 in the Gulf of Maine. But so they're ranging from light to dark in their pigmentation, and then we're matching them based on these discrete features. And we maintain a catalog that basically covers primarily this area that you're seeing right now. So this is the Gulf of Maine. And again, it's really the waters off of New England, and it includes the Bay of Fundy in the population term that we use. So these are all sightings that we've made during our research. And I think an important thing to understand is that in order to be able to study this population, we have to travel to all of the places where the whales go. So we do the research cruises every year. Well, prior to COVID, we'll be resuming them soon, but we are trying to cover all of the waters, both US and Canadian waters, where the whales that we catalog aggregate. And we're able to collect samples at that time when we see them in the field. And yeah, so we're the only ones actually that are conducting this kind of research on this kind of scale for this population. And it's again, critical to the success of our long-term data set. In addition to our dedicated surveys, we also collaborate with local researchers in different parts of the range of this species in the Gulf of Maine, and whale watching companies. We originally collaborated with the dolphin fleet back in the early days, in the late 1970s, mid to late 1970s. And that really sprung a lot of the research that we now do in a dedicated fashion. But there are whale watch boats and whale watch companies around the Gulf of Maine that now collect data using our protocols, and they share that information with us. And we, in turn, share information back with them for education. So some of the long-term information that we collect is actually not only being used for science, but it's being used to educate and inspire conservation messages. And here I just wanted to show, so these, going back one, these are sightings of unique individuals. We've also been part of research to apply tags to individual humpback whales that we've known well. Part of the reason for that is to improve our understanding of how things happen between these sightings. And another really important purpose has been to use our knowledge of individuals and our ability to check up on them very, very regularly to basically evaluate the effects that these tags have on whales. Many people think that satellite tagging, that's how we know where everything is, or why don't we tag them all the time? But the reality is that the tags that are in use and that stay on a humpback whale and most large whales for any length of time, they're invasive. They penetrate the skin and into the blubber and into the muscle. I'm not showing you any of that. But the point is that it has only been until very recently that research could be conducted to evaluate those impacts. And that's work that is ongoing with us. And the work that we've done has actually improved satellite tags, and they're reduced their impact on humpback whales. And in fact, made it so that tags that are being deployed, say in the Southern Hemisphere, things where people can't really look to see what happened to the whale, and that's why they were tagging it. That's all of that work is being informed by research that we've done here and tag improvements to better their lives. So coming back to this is some of the movements that humpback whales that we've tagged here have made. You can see they're using waters all around the Gulf of Maine. They additionally, these are adults, and they additionally transit out of the Gulf of Maine very rarely. And here we see that a few of them have made pretty giant movements up to farther and more distant waters, other feeding grounds off of Canada. So where I wrote there, St. Pierre and Miquelon, you can see basically that's a different feeding ground. In general, there's very little exchange between the Gulf of Maine and areas like the Newfoundland, St. Pierre and Miquelon, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but we do see a little. And it's something that we're monitoring to better understand how, or helping to guide photographic comparisons to these areas to see how things change over time. So the big tool, so we collected all these data, the massive tool that we use is the Gulf of Maine Humpback Whale Catalog. And this is, decades and decades of histories of individuals, individually identified from their fluke patterns, looking at all sorts of elements of their reproduction, their behavior, their life, their survival, where they're actually going and what other parts of the ocean they're connecting with. So this is really our most precious resource, and it's what we spend an incredible amount of time on. And as I alluded to before, it's rare. This is not the kind of resource that exists in most other places in the world for humpback whales. And a lot of it just has to do with our ability to relocate, re-identify these individuals and build this record of them. And tied to that are, as I mentioned, the sample archives. We're using that to determine the sex of individuals when we couldn't otherwise know it, which is most of the time, how they're related to each other, the individual matching that we do, or their identity from genetics that we can use to match them from one place to another, even if, for example, after death, we may not be able to see their features. Using genetics, we can actually match to a carcass and determine perhaps what has happened and link to that long-term history. So many other things. So one of the most critical things that this resource has done for us is it allowed us to ground truth new methods that are now being used in other parts of the world. So we have samples from individuals of known characteristics and known identity. We collect these samples, we collaborate with all kinds of different researchers and different disciplines, and we're able to help them to determine how accurate what it is they're developing is, so that then can be applied elsewhere. And and I'll just give you two examples. Well, really three. Many people are wondering about the age of humpback whales and the longevity of humpback whales. The reality is, unless you see a whale, humpback whale as a calf with its mother, which it stays with her for the first year, you do not know their age. The size of them is not as informative as one might like. So we have a treasure trove of information about the ages of individuals linked to genetic samples that have been used now to create, to link to changes in the expression of their DNA. And because we were able to ground truth it, that has now led to work in the Southern Hemisphere where they can apply that now because it applies across species, but they couldn't get there without it. And similarly, the second thing, the validation of blubber-based pregnancy testing. This is something that comes entirely from the data that we have that was able to connect the hormone state of an individual female with whether she was pregnant or not. And again, these two things now in combination have been applied in the Southern Hemisphere and other places to really better inform people about how humpback whales, if they weren't seen in a state, or pregnancy, you can't tell by looking at a whale. You have to see the calf afterwards. So these are important tools that are now being used elsewhere, and it comes all from this long-term data that we're collecting here. So I just want to touch upon, as I mentioned, there's really too much stuff to get into in a single lecture, but we talked about the past and the present and the future, and I just want to give you a couple of examples of these things and how it relates to our research here, our long-term data collection, our Gulf of Maine humpback whale catalog, which, by the way, is the catalog of record for the Gulf of Maine, and essential for research, but also management efforts and things of that nature. So starting with, past and present and future, they can all be connected. And the one leads to the other, which leads to the next, but we just often don't necessarily know how that all fits together. So there are different ways that you can do that. And I just wanted to call attention to one study that we've been involved with recently that was focusing on climate change. And one of the challenges with climate change and trying to figure out what the effects might be on a population is that we don't see that population. We're not seeing it now. We have to wait to see what's going to happen. And it's not very precautionary. And so what we did with this very large group of collaborators, you can see 26 institutions collaborating on this project, looking at all kinds of whale species, including humpbacks, looking at the prey that they eat, looking at just an immense number of samples that required long-term research and analytical span of a tremendous amount of time. We basically targeted a period of time in history, the geological history, when there was climate change, an increase in temperature that is similar in terms of the magnitude and the quickness at which it's happening now. And so we use genetics basically to look at what happened in terms of that. And we learned a lot of different information about how the main take home was really that it depended on where you are in the ocean, all of the factors going on in different oceans with different characteristics, what the exact effect would be. But really, really important is that we saw these changes that went on due to, say, the freeing of water from glaciers and things like that. Basically, what we found is that process, some of which we're seeing now, took millennia to actually kind of, the effect on the populations really took a long time. It affected populations for a long time. And so it's a cautionary tale for us as we're looking at this now. It's not, it's something that could affect the size of populations and the distribution of populations for many more years than we might have ever imagined on a geological timescale, basically. One thing I wanted to mention, though, that is that, so that's looking at the past to try to imagine something about the future. To a certain degree, we can use the present to imagine some things about the future. And what I'm showing you here is, I mentioned that humpback whale breeding grounds, humpbacks migrate to specific places. Well, the places where they go, these low latitude areas, they're really bound by a very tight temperature range. So if it's too hot, so these are basically all the oceanic breeding grounds that you're seeing labeled in white. And they're all in this very narrow range. So too hot doesn't work, too cold doesn't work for breeding. Oops. And so this study, this is another one where this was based on our research at American Samoa in the Southern Hemisphere. Again, it's based on 20 years of research, a lot of collaborating institutions, a lot of research, and a lot of individuals sampled, but basically looking at individuals and how they're using habitats across the entire South Pacific Ocean. And basically what was found is that even basically the lines, the curves that you're seeing here, these are telling us where the temperature thresholds are for what is suitable breeding territory. And Samoa, American Samoa up there, you can see it's very, very close right now to the limit on what is a suitable breeding temperature. And it's also as you can see from the little yellow box there, it is actually a pretty important area in terms of the densities of humpback whales that aggregate there. And so what you're seeing is the current where we are now. And if you look at that hashed area, the darker blue, that's where we're going to be, and not that long from now, in terms if everything that's happening in the oceans happens as it's happening now. So the predictions are that the areas where humpback whales are going to be able to breed in the 2080 and beyond is a very different place. It's not going to be a place where humpbacks are not going to be breeding in American Samoa, and it's going to be changing the landscape of breeding grounds for this species. So this is our work today, telling us in the short term, really in time frame points of view, what we might see happen if things don't change for humpback whales. Again, American Samoa, yeah, ignore that. So these are the key notes about it. Basically, where if things don't change, it's going to be unsuitably warm for humpback whales to breed in a lot of different places in the southern hemisphere. And yeah, it's going to change how they're using their habitats. We don't know yet. We haven't modeled yet how it's going to look for other oceans, for example, in the northern hemisphere, in the North Atlantic. But similar patterns, depending on what the predictions of water temperature are going to happen. I am using up way too much time. I apologize. The last thing I just wanted to talk about, and it's very relevant to this week. Those of you probably saw in the news the death of an individual that we've known very well, a whale named Luna, who we knew for more than 44 years. He was over 44 years old. A necropsy was done very recently. The preliminary findings of that are that he died from a ship strike, but that has to be confirmed from some analytical results, some lab work. But basically, ship strikes and entanglement in fishing gear, these are the major sort of immediate causes of death that we know of, versus sort of longer term things, changes in environment. And obviously, ship strikes, some individuals survive them. This is a massive wound on a whale named Piano, got her name from, the wounds and the shape of the wounds. So some whales survive, some whales don't. And long-term data can help, when we have it for the right places, help to manage people a little bit differently to reduce the chances of interactions. So this is an example of the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. They were using our data and data from the former Whale Center of New England, and basically using where whales had been sighted and finding that where the existing shipping lane going into Boston, that was going right over some of the key areas. And through some diplomacy and working with the shipping industry, the sanctuary was able to use our data to suggest just a very minor change, which is hoped to have reduced the number of interactions between whales and ships. But again, there's a big coastline. There are a lot of places in the ocean where similar work would have to go on. And then the unusual mortality event. So Luna, who died this week, essentially, he's part of a larger trend. It's been going on for since 2016. And what you can see in the right side there, a few years prior to this increase in mortality, and then in the orange, you can see how much higher in general strandings. These are the individuals that have died. If you look in the left pane, you can see the distribution of these sightings along the US East Coast. And we can share with all of you folks later a link that will actually allow you to see these by date and by month and by location, and really dive deep if you're interested in these different events that have occurred since 2016. They're obviously being studied intensively. We're part of the investigative team. Our role really is to determine who these individuals are and to provide their history. So just in this time period, there have been 180 cases. And so every time there's some kind of information, either from photographs or from a skin sample where we can do a genetic analysis, we're trying to make the connections that basically help us to understand why this individual died, what in terms of the vulnerability in the past. In Luna's case, we actually collected a whole bunch of data in addition to that to help us understand some of his life. So we collected data that will help us age him more precisely, because right now we just have a minimum age, and it's bounded by the duration of our research program. But stress hormones, other things like that, we've ground truthed it. We're getting those data from him, from the stranding network, and having been on site to help to inform that. This is a whale named Spinnaker. It was a similar situation. She died just prior. And many of you, I think, will have been at the center and seen her skeleton. She was an entangled whale who we disentangled several times. And we saw her as a calf. We know her whole life's history. And we still use data from her death to ground truth information about biological things, stress levels and things like that, to help us to understand whales and to help better understand what happened to her. And the last thing I'll mention, since I'm going on pretty late, is that as we see these changes over time and we see the numbers of deaths rising here in the US waters, an obvious question is, why is that happening? And it's particularly important because the event started in 2016, and that was the same year that humpback whales in the Western North Atlantic were removed from the endangered species list. So they're not considered endangered now, but they are still protected by laws like the Marine Mammal Protection Act. This is the information that we had until recently, which doesn't really give us much information at all about how abundance trends over time. And it's really just quite confusing as you look at these pieces of information and try to piece them together in terms of what's happening from the population overall. And so this is just some things that are going on right now. We've actually been able to use our long-term data set and our region wide effort and this information that we have about individuals, the demography. So we're able to calculate what the abundance trend has been over, in this case, 20 years, and look at how different age classes and sexes are contributing to the trends over time. So you can see, looking at the black marks there, the population's increasing, but it actually, maybe not look like it from this, but it's actually increasing quite slowly. Both for the overall population and the adults. And you can see at the very bottom, those white things, that's the abundance of juveniles, the minimum abundance of juveniles in the population. And it's quite variable and not increasing. So it's a very slow increase over time. We're glad to see there wasn't a decrease in population abundance from 2016 onward for the overall population for adults. But we are worried about juveniles, and juveniles are primarily whales that we find along the coast, south of the Gulf of Maine. The last thing I'll say is that there are a lot of things that you might imagine being able to use your data for. A lot of the things I've described weren't things that were really known when population studies got into play. And the data, the value of the data really increases from over decades in an exponential way. One thing, it's still pretty amazing to me that we were able to do is, we're not just learning about whales, we're not just learning about humpback whales, but we're using data from this species, from one individual named Salt. We were able to sequence her genome, and it's actually helping to clarify how animals that are large, like whales, for whatever reason, have sort of gotten around or are able to tackle their cancer rates compared to smaller animals. And it's been something that's been confusing, and it's a paradox really over time. But essentially, SALT has really helped us to identify some of the specific mechanisms that help prevent or seem to help to combat the likelihood of cells getting out of control in cancer mechanisms, and have basically that's putting tools in the toolbox for people who are trying to understand and maybe in the future prevent cancer. So I will leave you with that. You know, it's amazing the things that we are able to do that we never thought. So I've gone plenty long. I would just like to thank you all for joining and for caring about humpback whales and being interested in our research. Most of the things that I pointed out there's really only one thing that actually has dedicated financial support. So it's just a sad element of having a long-term data set that it's hard to get people really motivated to be in it for the long haul versus recognizing the value of it. So we hope that's something that will change, but it's a really important thing that we struggle with. So anyway, I'd just like to thank you all. I haven't seen any other questions, so I apologize for not answering any, but I'm happy to take your questions now.
Fantastic, Jooke. That was amazing. I have the questions here. I can read to you if you'd like. Thank you, Jooke.
Even now. Okay. Hi.
I can, I'm debating about taking off your spotlight, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes, we have some excellent, super well-informed questions in the chat. So I was just going to read through each one, and that'll give you the ability if you need to restart or show anything. First one is it's not an easy one, how have whales been impacted by plastics, large pieces to micro pieces, from Patrick?
Yeah, so that's something we're still trying to figure out. And actually our right whale program is collaborating to look at the amount of microplastics that are in the food that they're collecting that right before the whale is going to eat it. So that it's a little bit easier for that species in the sense that they're eating really low on the food chain. They're eating that plankton, and so you're able to attribute it much more easily than for humpback whales, where they're a little bit higher on the food chain. But we definitely, so I don't have the answer, but we do know that there can be microplastics in the prey that they're eating, and we would expect that to be a bad thing, but more work has to go on for this species.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how typical is it for a mother and calf to have a second full-grown whale accompanying them? I've seen this with Nile, and I wonder if it's common to have an aunt accompany them. This is Susie from New Jersey.
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. It's not uncommon amongst all of the classes of whales. Mothers and calves are a little bit more likely to spend time by themselves, both on the breeding ground and on the feeding ground. But we do see them joined often by, it could be a young whale or it could be an older whale. But what is unclear is exactly what the purpose of that is. And it's very rare that those would be related individuals or necessarily whales that have spent a lot of time together before compared to, say, anybody else who's in that immediate area. So it's not, I realize you're saying aunt like auntie versus a related whale, but it would be uncommon for actually any two very closely related whales to spend time together. And it's much more likely to have to do with how the individuals in the Gulf of Maine, how they're feeding, whether they're sharing some feeding skills or whatever that they're keenly simpatico on. One of my staff, Jen Tackaberry, actually studies that very thing. She looks at how individuals relate to each other based on their demography and their history. So that work is still ongoing, but it's not uncommon, but it's not for a genetics reason or relatedness reason.
Well, that's awesome. From Douglas, do we know what senses the whales are using to recognize the location of their childhood breeding ground?
That's another great question. We believe that there's a mechanism similar to the cueing in on the feeding ground from having come there with the mother. Um, but we don't know exactly how we believe they're learning the migration route and they're learning the feeding ground location from their mothers. It only makes sense that a similar thing would be going on in retrospect. But we don't know exactly.
These are all great research questions. Well, the next one is also good from Richard Goldenberg. At the breeding grounds, what is the food supply like for adults? Is it lack of food in the breeding grounds that drives the whales to the feeding grounds?
Another great question, something I should have covered. They don't eat at all on their breeding grounds. Really, their presence there seems to have more to do with the physical characteristics and the temperature. So while they're on the feeding grounds, like in the Gulf of Maine here, they're eating, and they're piling on the pounds, really the blubber layer, and that's what's going to keep them going for the entire time that they're on their breeding grounds. We have seen them feed very opportunistically if there happens to be a school of fish that makes sense, but it's very rare to see that. So what's going on the breeding grounds is just entirely about the calf and mating with the females who might want to be down there for their calves.
Excellent. That was a great question. From Kathy Shore, can you talk about the way that research on individuals has an impact on scientific discoveries and conservation efforts? How easy is it to get funding for this work? I think you mentioned this a little bit, but
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you mean, but really it's been fundamental. All of these ways that we're able to link things about individuals to their state and you hear and use that information to really ground truth things and allow it to be applied other places. But as I mentioned, and also for conservation efforts, understanding overlaps between um, certain threats and individual risks associated with those threats. So not just, oh, these generic whales were in one place or another, but this individual visited this area regularly. How does that relate to its risks? And if it happened, then a death potentially. But getting funding is incredibly hard. People are happier to support specific applications, but the only reason we can do a particular application is because we have decades and decades of work, and the decades and decades part is not funded. And so it's our biggest challenge, I would say, in terms of helping to keep all of this kind of research going.
thank you. A great suggestion from Barbara about adding a year of sighting to Salt's family tree. Kathy Florsheim, another Kathy asks, if it's clear that a whale has died from a ship strike, is there any way to determine what vessel is responsible?
That's a tough one. It often is not clear. And what's a real big challenge for ship strikes versus entanglements, for example, is that sometimes the evidence is all internal. So you might not see anything on the outside. And that's really, really tough, especially because resources are limited. Not every carcass can be examined in the way that might provide that information, both because the carcass may never come to land per se, and there might not be resources to tow it. For North Atlantic right whale, a tremendous amount of resource go toward that critical information and data gathering process. There's less money for that in humpback whales, but basically for ship strikes, it has to be an detailed examination to rule out ship strike. Obviously, I showed you an example of the injuries on the outside of the whale. And in that case, that's easier, especially if the whale is not too decomposed, so you can't see it. But it's still not something where you could tell exactly which vessel unless it was witnessed and processed. But what you can see is, or figure out is, looking at the size of the injuries, you can get a sense of what the class of vessel might have been. So whether it's a little boat or a big boat.
That makes sense. Thank you. Question from Pat. Are you familiar with the Happy Whale Digest in Iceland? I've heard of that. And any chance that one can go on the expeditions, on the research
Um,
expeditions?
Yeah, so for Happy Whale, yes, in Iceland, but also it's a tool that's being used primarily by citizen science, and folks that are out on the water snap an image and they can contribute it there. Um, so yes, definitely aware of it. We're actually working with the developer of Happy Whale to do something that's really, really important, which is to test the ability of their algorithm because it works basically by automated matching. And they've made great strides with that. It's a highly accurate tool, but what we're not sure about yet is whether um, it's as good at identifying young whales, especially from the calf year on, early or those first few years, because that's when most of the changes in the pigmentation that it's cueing on happen. And in order to really get the best information, we need to know how accurate that is. And so this is another case where we're using our information, flukes over time for these young animals to help evaluate that. And that's work that's going on right now.
Could you quickly describe, Happy Whale to those on the call that might not know what it is? I mean, I've heard of it, but
Yeah, so it's a platform. It's a place where people can upload their picture and it's automatically matched to a catalog if there's a collaborator. So there are some places in the world where that's tremendously important because isn't an existing catalog and it's starting to piece information together. For our area, because we do have a long-term catalog, that's and processes by which all of these people share their information with us. It's less. Um, uh, I don't want to say less helpful. That's obviously not the case, but it's not the primary way that we understand things about whales, for example, in the Gulf of Maine. But again, we can try to help. If you search happywhale.com, some people have put their images there and they will get matches. But we still prefer that people work with us because we've been doing this for decades for our area.
excellent. Thank you. And the second part of that question is, of course, any chance that one can go on a research expedition?
Yeah, for us, that's really tricky because all of our work has to be authorized by the federal government, and we have to identify the roles of everybody involved. And it's, unlike a whale watch, everything needs to be science. So we're not able to take people on our boat with us in U.S. waters.
Thanks. From Judy, we hear a lot about fishing gear, yet lobstermen say their gear does not pose a risk.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it depends on the fishermen and it depends on where they're fishing, how their perceptions of things are in it. It's a big challenge because a lot of the documented entanglements, they can't be tracked back to a particular fishery or a particular gear type because some of the gear is gone or it's degraded or it's just really hard. And then I think those of you who have been on the water, you can probably appreciate this. And I certainly feel it as well. Sometimes you're out on the water and you're working with a whale, there's a whale there, and it might take 40 minutes to come up. You could actually lose that whale. So it's not uncommon at all for there to be whales present and in your vicinity, and you're actually not seeing them. So I think it's a combination of things. There's certain parts of certain areas where someone who's fishing may not be aware that there's a whale there, and it just seems so unlikely um, to them because they're just not seeing it. And there's just a lot of research that has to go on and better gear marking to help us understand, to make these cases between a specific entanglement and how it happened. And obviously, nobody's trying to entangle whales. That's not what's going on at all. It's just, an unfortunate, a bit like, if we're driving and there's a strike of a deer, something like that. People are trying to do their work, live their lives, but these intersections are happening. So really the key thing is to get the most information we can get. And a lot of that is actually coming from our disentanglement team. They're going out, disentangling the whales, removing the gear, sharing the gear with gear experts who then reach out to fishermen and understand things about the industry. So that work is all important. I lost my train of thought.
Well, no, and there's often, I didn't know until I started working here how far they might drag the gear. So just because they're disentangled in New Jersey or in Massachusetts, they could have picked the gear up elsewhere. And one set of gear or ropes entangles other sets, then they're become almost a Christmas tree, where you can really see that when you look at the pictures of spinnakers entanglements, that it wasn't just a single set. It's sometimes multiple sets.
Absolutely.
Two more questions. Is the lower birth rate due to lack of food for the young ones? That's a great question.
Well, there's something that we have come to understand, and it's pretty typical for mammals, which is that that year, right when you separate from your mom and you're learning how to do everything by yourself, some are better than that than others. So there's some amount of a higher level of mortality in just that age class right there. And as you look at young whales, it's often the case that you can see that the ones that are surviving, they're looking a little scrawny, or they don't look like an older whale because their body conditioning and whatnot. They're learning to live their lives. So as to specifically, so there's a mammalian process there that we expect. The greatest amount of mortality is in that first year, the highest probability of it. And so it may partially be due, like in any given year, it might have to do with either the amount of food that's available to that learner, or it may also have to do with the amount of food that was available to mom while she was still nursing her calf, and that potentially predicting how well off they started off to begin with when they had to start to learn. So there are a lot of things we don't know, but there's some general principles that make a lot of sense for mammals.
Absolutely. There's one last question. You kind of already answered it, but I want to make sure that we address all the questions from Judy again. Are both types of gear guilty of entangling whales? And I'm assuming you mean there's multiple types of gear, whether it's fishing, lobstering, shellfishing, crab pots, any kind of fixed gear.
Yeah, and again, that's tricky because often the information isn't there to link back to specific gear types, but we do see gillnet, we do see trap pot fisheries. Our sense of it is that it isn't necessarily the gear type per se, but the presence of the rope or line in the water, or the net that allows whales to intersect it and get caught on it. So it seems to be a more general principle. And that's why in recent years, most of the modifications to fishing has to do with reducing the amount of gear. So having fewer vertical lines in the water, making sure that the ground lines are laying on the bottom instead of arcing up. But these are all just really challenging questions when the data is hard to come by.
Excellent. Thank you. That makes complete sense. Well, I wanted to thank not only our donors and long-term supporters who, without your help, we couldn't do so much that we're doing. We're building a new genetics lab. Jooke has managed to get funding for the National Science Foundation. It's going to be amazing. I hope if you all are up here, you get a chance to come tour it. Should be done, we're thinking, at the end of May. It's enabling us to do so many, have new relations with scientists all over the world who all want to come work with Jooke, as you can imagine. I wanted to thank everyone from Aquatic Adventures and Heather for being here and for inviting everyone. Some great questions. Do we have anything else last minute? I didn't know if either Jean or Sue wanted to say anything, but Jooke, this has been a great pleasure. It's always incredible information, and you're getting, the latest. This is talking to someone who's, finding out new things every day.
I just
Jean.
like to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let me just add how grateful I am, and I'm sure everyone else is, that you're here with us working on these important issues. and that you've shared some of it with us. It is astonishing that you'll even talk to me, Jooke. I mean, it's just amazing the work that you're doing. It's so important.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, we can only do it because you folks are interested. You are part of, you know, our lives and our ability to keep these things going. So I really thank you all for being interested and being here and really wanting to learn. It's wonderful.
Absolutely. I mean, you're coming up into the more areas that can't get funded federally or through state or municipal, especially with the delisting of Humpback. So making a huge difference. Kathy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, let me make a suggestion about fundraising. Tell your audience that you need general funds. Because if that's your biggest challenge, you need to tell us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the
Right.
archive is also really important.
Yeah.
Good point, Kathy. Thank you.
I'd just like to echo Sarah's thanks for everyone who's been on today and your interest and helpful support and suggestions. And I'll just mention that the recording is going to be made available to you. We'll send it around to you. It'll be on either Vimeo or YouTube, and you can see it again, or you can share it with your friends and let them know about the important work that's going on here. So I think with that, unless there's any further questions, we will wrap it up for the evening. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.